What's up, gangsters? It is a gloomy, cold, damp, breezy day out here at Rube Goldberg Enterprises. And what's ridiculous about that is that it's almost the end of May. I don't know what to think, but if you lived here and you believed that you could extrapolate local conditions to global conditions, you would definitely be a global warming skeptic. I'm not, but let's don't get into the politics of that sort of thing. What I do want to get into is one of my favorite topics, because I don't really have anything specific to talk about today. That is weathering. One of my favorite things, I confess, and I'm sure a lot of people who watch my stuff and see my posts on the old interwebs know that I am a whore for weathering. I love filthy shit. It's kind of weird because in my personal life I like things to be, clean and tidy. I like my vehicle to be clean on the inside and the outside. As much as possible, I try to keep my workbench relatively shipshape. But I love the beauty that exists in dirt and oil and fuel stains and rust and grime of all sorts, because it just, to me, is it's just so interesting because of the natural tonal variety that you get from that sort of thing. So, I'm going to talk about it. But a couple of disclaimers before I get started. The first disclaimer is this is not a technique video. I'm not going to talk much, if any, about how to do specific weathering techniques. That's for a different time. This is more about the philosophy of weathering and how we think about it as model makers. And that gets to the second disclaimer, and that is, if when I said philosophy of weathering, you were like, what? This video may not be for you. If it never occurred to you that there was a philosophy and you're curious, then maybe this video is. But if you are the kind of model maker who likes to put them together and go by a formula where you paint them, you gloss coat them, you decal them, you gloss coat them again, you flat coat them, you put a wash on there at some point, and all your panel lines are black, whatever, that's fine. Everybody pursues this hobby for their own reasons. And if you're just somebody who likes to put them together to kill time and the weathering portion isn't important to you, or you prefer the factory fresh look, then that's cool. That's your prerogative. But on the other hand, if you are like me and you obsess with the way that filth can create a sort of beauty, and you view your model making projects as an artistic expression, and I don't want to get into a whole argument about whether model making can be art or not. That is also a different video. But if you have a vision for how you want the thing to turn out before you ever take it out of the box, and you have an intent to get to that point using particular methods and tools and references in the service of that vision, then this video may be for you, because that's what I'm going to talk about with respect to weathering. Now, the final disclaimer, and that is this: everything from this point forward is 100% my opinion, and I know that it is. So, if I say things in a way that sounds like I'm presenting it as fact, just understand that's just how I'm expressing my opinion. I'm not trying to tell you that this is the gospel or that this is definitive, because That's the thing about weathering, and this is what I really want to talk about, is that we work with a limited set of facts and a whole lot of extrapolation and having to use our imagination. And this video is about how we can do that and what constitutes going too far, not far enough, whatever the case may be. In fact, that's a good place to start right off the bat with the discussion of what constitutes too much weathering. One of my greatest pet peeves when I'm looking through comments on Facebook is when somebody says that particular weathering is overdone. Overdone. It annoys the shit out of me because it's such a meaningless comment without any sort of context. If you say, given that your aircraft was a carrier-based fighter plane in the Vietnam conflict, the amount of filth that you have on it might be excessive. It might be overdone. Well, then that kind of makes sense. That's a qualified comment. But if you just blanket throw out there that somebody's weathering is overdone, it's meaningless because you don't really understand what the model maker's intent was, and so you don't really know if it's over or underdone. And the funny thing is, you never really see proponents of weathering like me say, oh, your weathering is underdone. Because I think people that get into the weathering the way that I do understand that that would also be meaningless. The way that I look at it is there is no such thing as over or underdone weathering. There's only good or bad storytelling. And so you have to consider whether or not what you've done is representative of the story that you're trying to tell. And that means that you've got to establish some context. I mean, look, ideally, in my view, a good model is just like a good photograph in that it tells a story for the viewer without you having to put a caption on it and explain a bunch of things. But unfortunately, that just never works out perfectly. There's always, typically, a little bit of explanation that's warranted or that at least makes the presentation more effective. But the more you can do without having to write a bunch of little words telling everybody what your model is supposed to represent, the better off you are. So that's what I mean when I talk about good or bad storytelling. Let's say, for example, that you just throw a model out there of a Formula One car covered with mud, and that's all you do. Well, it's understandable why people might say that it was overdone or that it was wrong, because why would a Formula One race car be covered with mud? And you might respond with, well, he ran off the track and went through the infield and it was a rainy day and so it was muddy and now the car is muddy. And obviously everyone can understand that sort of logic and explanation, and that's good. But the bottom line is you failed at the storytelling because you didn't place this thing in a sufficient context that people could look at it and go, oh, I get it. I understand why it's muddy. So, good or bad storytelling. That's a key thing for me. The second thing that I try to focus on with weathering is once I establish a story in my mind that I want to tell, that leads me to taking a look at the patterns. I believe that weathering is fundamentally chaos within a pattern. And what do I mean by that? I think the best way to explain it is to show you something that I'm working on right now, because it's all about establishing those patterns and sub-patterns and then trying to work a bunch of chaos into those. So let's take a look at what I got going on. Okay, so what I have going on here is a 1/32 Special Hobby Tempest. And I am trying to tell a sort of a complex story here with my paint. you may or may not know that immediately after World War II ended, the RAF issued directives to paint all of their fighter aircraft in what they called RAF high-speed silver, which is basically a silver aluminum lacquer. In a lot of cases, the aircraft were just painted directly over the camouflage. And it wasn't necessarily a quality job. So there was going to be some wear and tear. But the way that I'm trying to illustrate that story is with the way that I'm weathering this thing. I didn't really want to do just bare camo because basically everybody does those with Tempests. But I also didn't want to just do this huge thing in acres and acres of plain silver paint because for me, that's just not very interesting. So the way that I'm trying to establish the overall context here, hopefully you can see this, is I first started with recognition of the fact that the major wear pattern on an aircraft like this is the foot traffic that happens along the wing walks and outward on the wing where the crewmen walk to service the gun bays. So I thought, okay, I can illustrate that by having some of the high-speed silver paint worn off and exposing the camouflage colors underneath. So that's the first big pattern that I wanted to establish. So I've sprayed camo colors as my base layer, and then I did chipping fluid, hairspray in this case, and then I've sprayed the high-speed silver over the top of that. That gives me the basis for telling this story and working within this pattern. But there are sub-patterns in here that I want to use to illustrate specifically how the wear takes place. So let me kind of zoom in on this. One of the patterns is that there is a greater amount of traffic along the wing walk. That just happens because of the fact that the pilot board's there. The crew chief may be standing there. That happens on both sides of the fuselage. That happens where they're doing engine servicing, refueling, all those kinds of things that we know about. I mean, I'm not telling you anything that you aircraft guys don't already know. But point being is that there's a greater amount of traffic there in that part of this overall pattern than there is out here. So I wanted to use two different weathering approaches. For this, I wanted to do straight up chipping. For this, I just wanted to show that the paint was basically getting faded and worn and scuffed. So instead of using chipping, even though I have some chipping fluid here and I did chipping in some very specific areas, this is mostly done with sandpaper, which is one of my favorite things because look, that is actually replicating the physical abuse that the paint takes in real life, just on a much smaller scale. So I've just randomly sanded the paint thin so that it shows through more or less in certain areas what the colors are underneath. I also did basically a black basing technique when I painted the silver so that I had random areas of paint that were thicker than others. And when you zoom in on that, you can kind of see what I'm talking about. It's kind of got that splotchy appearance that I was after. But to get back to this wear pattern here on the wing walk, that I was obviously going to do with chipping. But what I wanted to do was illustrate that in some areas the traffic is heaviest and it's going to wear all the way through to the aluminum underneath all the paint. Then some of the camo colors are going to be worn on top of that. And then on top of that was the black wing walk stripe, and it gets worn. And then over all of that is the silver paint that's almost worn completely off. So what I've done is treated each one of those paint layers as its own thing and done chipping on each one successively. So the first thing I did was I put down a base layer of aluminum. Then I've got the camo colors over that. In certain places where the wear is the heaviest, I've chipped all the way through that. Then I came back and sprayed another layer of hairspray, masked off the black stripe, and then came back and chipped that. And then again another layer of hairspray, the silver paint, came back and chipped that. And so what that does is that gives me a layered effect that helps tell the story of the way that that paint has worn successively down through those colors. But going back to what I was talking about with weathering being chaos within a pattern, let's talk about how I got this chaotic appearance, because that for me is the most important thing with creating authenticity or realism, which is its own subject that I'll talk about in a second. Chipping fluid works really good for that, but it also comes down to using the right tools and using them in the right ways. Our brains just really don't want to do random. We love repetition. That's just part of how we're wired as a species. So what I believe is that it helps a lot to allow your tools to create the randomness for you within the pattern that you've established. And so one of the things that I like to do is use the largest but least aggressive brushes that I can when I do chipping. A lot of people like to do chipping with little sharp things like toothpicks or needles or whatever the case may be. And that's not wrong, but it creates a different effect, and it requires you to be more random in your thinking, because if you're going to do a tiny bit of chipping around each one of these Zeus fasteners, for example, with a sharp tool, which is what I did here, again, you've got to focus on the fact that you need chaos within the pattern that exists, or the sub-pattern that exists with each one of those fasteners. So what I do is I go big to small. I like to use this brush right here that I've cut off, and it's flat on the end, but it's still relatively stiff. And I use this tapping motion as I'm working in the pattern, within the pattern there. And even though I'm not being random at all with where I'm tapping, because I'm working inside that pattern, the way that the brush deforms and flexes creates its own sort of chaos. And so I get lots of chips of different sizes in random locations. And you can never have a chip too small. That's another sort of fundamental thing about scale. Basically, the way I try to think about chipping is its location, its size, its distribution within the pattern, its definition. I mean, you want chips that look like chips, and diffusion. And diffusion, for me, is one of the most important aspects of creating realistic chipping, because the way that it happens in nature is you don't really typically get just this one area where material is completely worn off and then suddenly the color changes. What you get is a diffusion of one large area of wear and lots of much smaller ones that are randomly scattered all the way around it that bleed out to eventually there being none. And that's what I mean when I talk about the diffusion of chips. So anyway, I hope that sort of illustrates what I'm talking about when I say that weathering is randomness within a pattern or chaos within a pattern, as well as what I mean when I talk about allowing your tools to help you create the chaos that you're looking for. Here's another illustration of that on the bottom, because I'm now getting into doing the wheel wells. If you take a look at the wash that I've used in here, hopefully this will show up. You can see that there's a really random distribution of the grime in there, and you can do that with oils or enamels and a brush, but it takes a lot of work, and it's not necessarily going to be random, because you're counting on your brain to produce the chaos. What I like to do as much as possible is let nature take its course, and here's sort of another look at that gives even maybe a better illustration of it. This is one of the gear doors. And hopefully here, well, this will maybe focus a little bit better if I put it over here. You can kind of see that there's a lot of really weird patterns going on in there. And hopefully you agree that those are pretty realistic and pretty authentic, because it should be obvious that those are created by nature and not by someone just trying to be random. They definitely are not the same on both gear doors. And again, there's lots of chaos within the pattern. And the way that I did that was I used ink thinned with alcohol, specifically Winsor & Newton inks. Because what I've learned is that when you use a mix like that that's thinned with alcohol, it behaves in a totally different way from when you use oil paints or enamels that are thinned with mineral spirits. The way that they dry and then and leave residue behind is just very different. And in my view, that uniqueness creates something that's a lot more authentic than I could do using oils or enamels. You can see what I'm talking about just with that sort of speckled appearance. And I believe that that's the way that, let's say, this aircraft is operating on rainy days and you've got lots of water and grime and trash getting flung up inside here and collecting and then drying in random ways. And I just don't trust my brain to be able to reproduce that. So I'm allowing my tools to help me create that randomness within the pattern. But you can see sometimes you miss a spot. There's a little place right inside there where it didn't cover, and so I need to go back and touch that up. But look at how it creates this sort of pattern on the side of the wheel well. Hopefully this will show up. Let me drag some light over here a little bit closer. You can see how it kind of goes down in that U shape right here on the side of the wheel well. And that's a pretty normal pattern with the way that fluids creep and dry and migrate. And that happened purely because of the way that the alcohol blended with the ink chose to dry. And I like that. If I didn't like it, I would be able to wash it off because I'm working directly on top of these MRP lacquers, which don't give such a porous surface that it would allow the wash to soak in and create a more permanent stain. If I'd been working on top of an acrylic, though, it would stain in a totally different way, and that might be a good thing. Again, it just depends on what you're after. Okay, so there we go. Chaos within the pattern. So the final thing that I want to talk about is the idea of realism or authenticity versus accuracy. Because this is something else that comes up a lot in these conversations online. Speaking of accurate, I don't think I have the camera very straight up and down, so let me fix that. Model makers, we just can't help but be a little bit OCD, right? Anyway, not that having the camera straight is going to make me look any better. Anyhow, realism versus accuracy. It's also kind of, to me, meaningless to, or maybe just not, properly expressive, whatever, when somebody says, yeah, your weathering isn't realistic. Well, what does that actually mean? And I find what I think a lot of people mean more often than not is they don't consider it to be accurate. Because a lot of times that "it's not realistic" comment is followed up by, these tanks were only in service for a matter of months, So it simply would not be realistic for them to be that rusty. Okay, well, at least at that point, you've established some qualifications on your opinion, so that's good. But I would argue that that's more a question of accuracy than it is of realism. Let me explain what I mean. For me, realism and authenticity of weathering get down to how effectively we reproduce the chaos within the pattern. In other words, how authentically have we reproduced the mud splatter on the fenders, or the way that rainwater continuously running across a rusty patch of iron creates a rusty streak on a painted surface. That is, to me, authenticity or realism. If I just take my paintbrush and I start smacking it all over my model airplane with silver paint, that's not going to produce a very realistic appearance of chipping. It's going to look like exactly what it is, which is that I took my paintbrush and smacked it all over my model airplane to try and produce chipping. On the other hand, if I use chipping mediums and I remove paint using the appropriate tools to create that randomness, that's a very realistic reproduction of chipping, because it's exactly how it happens in real life. It's just happening on a very small scale. So that creates a much more realistic appearance. The accuracy thing comes in play if, let's say, for example, I declare that I'm building a World War II Corsair, and I do everything very realistically. I produce very realistic dust all over the wing surfaces and dusty tires, and it all is very perfectly executed and very authentic dirt on my aircraft. But unfortunately, the aircraft that I've chosen to depict was carrier-based. So, no dirt, no sand, no dust. Different kinds of grime, to be sure, even on an aircraft carrier. But that's an accuracy of failure. That's a failure of accuracy. That's a failure of storytelling. That's not over or underdoing the weathering. That's simply failing to tell the story that I set out to. And so, if someone calls you out on the accuracy of that, that's perfectly valid. But if you just say, well, your weathering isn't realistic, that doesn't really generate good discussion of whether or not the technique was good and the execution was good. And that's important, because even if you didn't tell the story well on this model, and you now find that out sort of after the fact, those techniques are still things that you or another model maker may want to use on another project where you'll do a better job of telling the story. So, I don't know. I just think that in the service of all of us learning things and improving our technique and being able to more effectively produce the creative vision that we have for our projects, that words matter. And the way we discuss these things is important. And so that's why I want to close with that point about realism versus accuracy. So there you go. Those are kind of the three or four things that I think are really important to effective weathering, kind of my philosophy when I'm doing my projects. How effectively am I telling the story that I've chosen to tell? How effectively am I producing the chaotic effect of the weathering phenomenon within the pattern that I need to use in service of telling that story? And finally, how effectively am I creating a realistic weathering effect as opposed to how accurate? I mean, obviously I want it to be accurate as well, but the most important thing is the realism of the work. So anyway, I hope that all of this rambling, as always, longer probably than it needs to be, or that I wish it was, but hey, that's what the fucking pause button is for. So I hope that it was worth whatever time you spent watching it, and that it gives you something maybe new to think about as you go forward in your own weathering projects. All right, guys, as always, if you've put up with my rambling this long, I really appreciate it. Much love.